Good evening. My name is Christine Kirby. I am the Assistant Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for the Bureau of Air and Waste, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our first stakeholder meeting for the Cumulative Impact Assessment work that we're going to be doing pursuant to the new climate law. This is a really important initiative for the department, and shortly you'll hear from the Commissioner. He's going to welcome you and kick off this very important project for the department, as well as we have other folks from here from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and the MEPA office. Next slide, please. So I wanted to cover quickly an overview of the agenda. As I said, Commissioner Suberg will give us a welcome on the initiative. And then we're going to cover an overview of the new climate law and the cumulative impact provisions of the law, both for MassDEP and the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Office. And we're going to talk a bit about what the various agency roles are for MassDEP, the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Office again, and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And we're going to talk about what our stakeholder engagement process is going to be throughout the process for MassDEP. And you'll hear a little more about the engagement process for MEPA from Tori Kim. We're going to talk about our rulemaking schedule, as you may know, and you'll hear this more from Glenn about our plan to have draft regulations out next year in 2022. And we're going to have a presentation from Tori Kim presenting the draft rulemaking and the plan for the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. Next slide, please. So before I turn it over to Commissioner Suberg, we wanted to introduce our key agency contacts. Again, I'm Christine Kirby. I am the Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Air and Waste. I'd like to next introduce Glenn Keith.
Hi, I'm Glenn Keith. I'm the Director of the Division of Air and Climate Programs. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, next up is Joanne Moran.
The Deputy Director of the Air and Climate Programs Division.
Okay, and Sandy Baird. Sandy there?
No, she's here.
Okay, Sandy is our Chief in the Toxicology Group for the Office of Research and Standards, and she's been a key person involved in this effort and will be going forward. And last for DEP, but not least, is Deneen Simpson.
Good evening.
And could you Deneen is our Environmental Justice Director for MassDEP. Really happy to have her. And then moving on to the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Rishi, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Rishi Reddy. I'm the Director of Environmental Justice for the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. I'm very happy to be here and see the group of folks who are coming to this evening meeting, and I hope you'll continue to be engaged through the following months.
Thank you, Rishi. And then we'd like to introduce Tori Kim from the MEPA office.
Hello, everybody. Tori Kim from MEPA within the Executive Office as well. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Tori and Rishi. And now I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Suberg, who is happy to be here, and he's going to give us a welcome and introduction on this very important initiative for the department. Marty?
Well, thank you very much, Christine, and to everybody. My name is Martin Suberg. I am the Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. And I want to thank you and welcome you for participating in this first meeting to gather input into developing new provisions for including cumulative impact analyses in categories of air quality permits. This meeting starts a very important process for the Commonwealth. And we at MassDEP and our partners at EEA want to ensure that stakeholders and all those with an interest in the regulations we will eventually propose are engaged in this process as fully as possible. By being here, you probably know that on March 26th of this year, Governor Baker signed an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. That climate law contains a provision directing MassDEP to evaluate and seek public comment on incorporating cumulative impact analyses into certain permits and to propose regulations within 18 months requiring cumulative impact analysis for air permits. That provision is the subject of this meeting and the meetings in the weeks ahead, planned into the spring, and which you'll hear about more shortly. In getting ready for this meeting, we have reached out to the environmental stakeholder community, municipalities, regulated communities that may be affected, environmental and business organizations, and especially environmental justice communities and organizations. MassDEP, as part of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, is committed to engaging environmental justice populations in various initiatives such as environmental decision-making through expanded and inclusive outreach, minimizing health risks through targeted environmental enforcement, and improving environmental quality in all communities. As part of the effort to address disproportionate environmental burdens, evaluating cumulative impacts is needed to ensure that communities are not overburdened by projects that may negatively affect the environment and/or public health. So tonight we start exploring this very complex topic of cumulative impact analysis with your help and insight. And we look forward to your engagement tonight, and hopefully we can count on it in the weeks and months ahead as we work towards developing regulations for our air permits. Thank you once again for your participation, and I'll turn it over now to Joanne Moran.
Thank you, Commissioner. I would just like to briefly review the Zoom meeting logistics as we go into our overview. Please be aware that the meeting is recorded. We want to make sure you are fully aware of that. And to minimize noise, all attendees have been put on mute initially. Sometimes helpful to leave your videos off. We will have initially, but we will have a section where we're doing some input where we will be able to, you'll have the choice to turn your videos on when you give comments. As noted on this slide, it's sometimes helpful to put your full name in your next to in your participants panel, where you can click on participants icon at the bottom of the screen, and then you can hover over your name and write out your full name and if you're with an association, you can put the name of your association, and that is sometimes helpful for everyone to see that if you wish to do that. So later on, we are going to have some input into when we describe our stakeholder process. And when we do that, you would be able to provide your comments by clicking in the participants panel on the raised hand icon if you're not used to working on Zoom. And then Maggie, our assistants from our tech from ERG would call on you. Or you can put a comment into the chat box, and then Glenn Keith from MassDEP will read what's in the chat box because not everyone can see the chat box. So those are the two ways you can participate when we get to that point in the process. So now I'm going to turn it over to Glenn Keith, who will start with the overview of our CIA process. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanne. As the commissioner noted earlier, the new climate law was signed in March, and it took effect 90 days later on June 26th. And specifically, it directs DEP to evaluate and seek public comment on incorporating cumulative impact analysis into air quality permits and to propose regulations within 18 months. It also directs MEPA, the MEPA office, Mass Environmental Policy Act office, to require an environmental impact report for certain projects that impact an environmental justice population. And this impact report would have to assess whether there's an existing unfair or inequitable environmental burden and related public health consequences, and how the proposed project might result in a disproportionate adverse effect on the environmental justice population. Next slide, please. Looking more closely at the statutory language in section 102C, this is the language that directs DEP to engage in this stakeholder process that we're now doing, starting tonight, and within 18 months after the effective date of this act, so 18 months from June, by then to propose regulations to include cumulative impact analysis in air quality permits. You'll notice that cumulative impacts are not defined in the statute, and the statute doesn't provide specific guidance on how to conduct a cumulative impact analysis. So that's going to be the focus of this stakeholder process. Next slide, please. And regarding the MEPA provision, the environmental impact report statements have to assess the potential existing unfair and inequitable environmental burden from any prior or current private, industrial, commercial, state, or municipal operation or project that has damaged the environment. So this provision is looking at not only current impacts, but past, as well as those posed by the facility. So the language in the MEPA section is very similar to the cumulative impact section. And Tori's going to talk a little bit more about that later. So these are very much related in terms of looking at impacts from multiple exposures from the past and the proposed projects. Next slide, please. So given the new climate law and the provisions that we're directed to implement, this slide shows our agency roles and activities, how we're going to be addressing this. And so MassDEP is going to engage in this process to develop regulations and guidance for cumulative impact analysis and air permits. The key contact for this effort at MassDEP is Joanne Moran, who you've met, and she will be coordinating the stakeholder process as well as working on a lot of the technical work. And I'll note that MassDEP has retained 2 contractors to support this effort. One is ERG for stakeholder process. They're helping us run this meeting tonight. And the other is Apt Associates to provide technical support as we look at different ways to conduct cumulative impact analysis. So they've got a great team that's going to help us, and they have experience looking at cumulative impact analysis. In addition to MassDEP, the MEPA office has its directive to develop regulations and guidance incorporating cumulative impact analysis in the MEPA review, and the contact there is Tori Kim, and we'll be hearing from her a little bit later in the presentation. And then finally, at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, there's an interagency work group that's being headed up by Rishi Reddy that's evaluating how cumulative impact analysis could be used by other state programs. And this work group includes representatives from the EEA agencies such as DEP, not only our air program, but also our solid and hazardous waste programs, our water program, our waste site cleanup program, and Office of Research and Standards, as representation from MEPA, also the Toxic Use Reduction Act program, and other agencies as well, Department of Public Health, Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and the Department of Public Utilities are all involved in this work group effort. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an overall timeline for developing the regulations called for by the Climate Roadmap Law. The law did set a very tight timeline for the MEPA office to promulgate regulations by the end of this year. And DEP has a longer amount of time to propose regulations by the end of 2022. But because both of these efforts involve looking at cumulative impacts, the MEPA office anticipates a first phase of regulations and then a potential second regulatory phase that would incorporate some of the details and processes and CIA protocols that we developed through this stakeholder process. And you'll hear a little bit more about that again from Tori. Next slide, please. Cumulative impact analysis is not a completely new concept. It's been in use for many years in different programs. For instance, the National Environmental Policy Act does require major federal actions that fall under MEPA review to look at cumulative impacts on the environment. And MEPA defines a cumulative impact as the impact on the environment which results from the incremental impact of the action when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future actions. Next slide, please. The state of California has also done a lot of work in this area, and including developing a statewide mapping tool called Cal EnviroScreen that can be used to characterize cumulative impacts based on a number of environmental, health, and demographic indicators. And California defines cumulative impacts to mean the exposures, public health or environmental effects from the combined emissions and discharges in a geographic area, including environmental pollution from all sources, whether single or multimedia, routinely, accidentally, or otherwise released. And impacts will take into account sensitive populations and socioeconomic factors where applicable and to the extent data are available. Next slide, please. And then most recently, New Jersey enacted a new environmental justice law that directs the New Jersey DEP to evaluate cumulative environmental and public health stressors or impacts affecting overburdened communities in certain permit decisions in New Jersey. And specifically, the environmental justice impact statement must assess the potential environmental and public health stressors associated with the proposed new or expanded facility and the environmental or public health stressors already borne by the overburdened community. And so you can see in all of these definitions being used by other states, they're quite expansive, looking at not just the proposed project or permit, but what does the community already bear, and is there a disproportionate impact? Next slide, please. So as we move forward with the stakeholder process, there are a few key questions to keep in mind, including what types of impacts should be included in a cumulative impact analysis, such as environmental impacts, health impacts, other demographic criteria that could be used. And then how should a cumulative impact analysis be conducted? There are some various models for doing that, but we will need to develop a model specifically that works for Massachusetts and uses Massachusetts data and processes and meets the needs of our state and our stakeholders. Another question is, what types of air permits should require a cumulative impact analysis? The climate law directs DEP to propose regulations for certain categories of air quality permits. So it doesn't mean that every single air permit or action would require a cumulative impact analysis. So that's a question we're going to have to answer through this process. And then finally, what criteria should MassDEP use to make permit decisions? What criteria should be used? Quantitative, which we already do in our air permit program, or qualitative. So there's going to be additional environmental and public health stressors that will be examined in the cumulative impact analysis process. And how do those result in a permit decision that MassDEP will have to make on each permit application? Okay, and with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Joanne.
Joanne, you're on mute.
Thank you. I didn't think I had. Okay, so for the stakeholder engagement process, we are planning on holding monthly meetings. We want those meetings to be accessible to as many people and organizations as possible. And so we will hold the same meeting at 2 different times, one during the day hours, daytime hours on Tuesdays, and one in the evenings on Wednesday, to accommodate different working schedules. We'll use these meetings to share and discuss information such as research on what other states have done and policy options. We will seek input at these meetings, but we will also receive comments subsequent to each meetings. Meetings will always be recorded and posted to MassDEP's YouTube channel along with our slides. And we will have specific CIA email listservs that you can sign up for to be notified of these meetings, to provide information and so forth. We'll have a later slide with those links to that email listserv, as well as a link to where you can continue to provide comments subsequent to this meeting. Our proposed meeting schedule in the next two slides show an initial plan for monthly meetings from August until next April, with planned topics for each meeting. For the next few meetings, our proposed focus is really to discuss the current research and potential policy options that may need to be considered in developing a cumulative impact analysis in the air permitting context of the Commonwealth. As you can see, in September, we will be going into depth in the background of the CIA in terms of the types, approaches, and terminology. And then in October, the topic will be environmental stressors, followed by public health stressors in November, examining what they are, how they're being used in other states, what data is available in Massachusetts and the quality of that data in Massachusetts, and how these stressors might be included in a cumulative impact analysis. In December, we'll be walking through our permitting program, how that works, and what are the different types of permits, and asking questions about how should the CIA apply to that program. For instance, that's where we're going to be asking and having discussions about what types of permit should require a CIA as one of the examples. So our goal is to have a conceptual model for the CIA by January, and then to have a series of meetings to work out the details of how the regulations would work, with an outline of regulations in March, and a first draft of regulations shortly after that. As we've said earlier in the meeting, we plan on proposing draft regulations in October of next year. We would like, so at this point, we would like to pause and just give you some time to perhaps give some initial input into our stakeholder process that we're planning. We have some questions here that maybe will elicit some of your input, but you're welcome to give other comments as well. But what suggestions, what we're looking for at this time is really, what suggestions do you have for input to the process? What would you like MassDEP to share information? How would you like us to share information? And how would you like to provide feedback and comments throughout the process? So we said before, you can raise your hand function and we'll call on you. You could also put comments in the chat function, and we will answer those as well. If you could keep your comments to just a reasonable time frame, just so we can get everybody's comments answered. The time limit isn't a hard limit. We're just trying to give an aspect of, so that everybody has a chance to speak. So when you are called upon, please unmute yourself. It'd be great if you would turn your video on so that we can see you, and then say your full name and let us know what your question is. So Maggie, if you could see if there are questions or comments.
Sure, Joanne. It looks like we don't have any questions so far, but oh, actually we do have one from John Walke.
Thank you. John Walke with Green Roots. And just a question in relation to, as we're going through this process, which seems pretty clear. I like the roadmap to it is very helpful. For the public, for folks in the community that are responding to, there's this big project coming into my neighborhood. There's a MEPA review or something. I don't know what that is, but I'm going out to give my comments to it. how should we be presenting to the public the relationship between this process and ongoing permits that are happening during the time period that the stuff is being drafted?
I think I'm not sure they have some other input on that. That's a really good question because I think our ongoing process is still going to proceed. And until we have new regulations, you know, you would still continue into our ongoing comment process, and that transition we're going to have to deal with as we get closer to new regulations and have to integrate things. But I would not stop anything that's ongoing at the moment. I don't think. Glenn, would you like to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, we, in terms of cumulative impact analysis, we don't have, you know, regulations in place yet. We don't even have a protocol in place at this point. So this is something that's going to be developed over time. But we still, in any of our permit processes, we have, there's opportunity for public involvement, especially from environmental justice communities. And we are making an effort in our air permitting program to reach out more and to provide that type of information and engage the community. So community engagement in any project should continue. And, you know, the community can certainly raise issues regarding the impacts of any project. But in terms of a formal cumulative impact analysis, you know, program, we don't have that yet in place.
So I expect that Tori is going to jump in on the MEPA process because that really is a pre-permitting process. She's going to get to that later in the presentation. So I don't know if you want to answer that briefly, Tori.
Yeah, I was just about to jump in on that, Christine. And John, you're aware of our MEPA process, and I've seen you on some of our meetings as well. So as I'll speak to in a bit, our process is quite a bit expedited compared to DEP. So we do expect to have some rules in place by the end of the year to at least have an interim approach to this cumulative impacts piece at MEPA. So it's a precursor to permitting. It won't, you know, be embedded into permitting standards, et cetera, but it will be a process that we expect to have in place for the MEPA review component by the end of the year.
Maggie, I see another hand. Do you see it?
Yep, so it looks like Paulina Casasola has a question.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Paulina Casasola. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here representing Clean Water Action and also the Environmental Justice Table. We want to thank MassDEP for their commitment to having or implementing cumulative impact assessments and considering the different stressors in environmental justice communities, and the opportunity to provide input as well. One thing that I'm concerned about is having folks who maybe work 2 jobs or don't have access to technology, or just don't hear about public hearing and input processes. How can we make sure that they are aware that these decision-making processes are going on and they have a say in what is happening in their communities? And then if MassDEP is sharing information either with stakeholders or even some nonprofits are also community centers, just making sure that we are being inclusive of everyone. And then the last thing is just to continue to consider the different or the intersectionality that happens in environmental justice issues and communities. So thinking about those folks who have asthma or those who have been affected most by COVID, and taking into account all of those things when looking at permit applications. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Just to respond to how we're reaching out, we've been trying to cast a very wide net to get as many people informed about this process as possible. I think that we're hoping and it would be great to hear from you folks on ways that we can get the word out to more people. I think we've been really comprehensive about it, but clearly we want to be as inclusive as possible. And I think your comment about the intersectionality of asthma and COVID impacts, those are all things that we'll consider during the process.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment. Yep, no other questions at this time.
Something more in the chat.
Looks like someone's just asking if they can submit comments at a later time, written comments at a later time.
Yes, certainly. And we were going to have, there will be a slide with how to do that at the end of the presentation and also on the website. And we'll have a link to the website as well with that information of a mailbox that you can submit comments to, and also a link for the MEPA process as well. So we will have that all information on the slides, which will also be listed on the website, so you'll be able to get that information. Definitely.
Great, thank you. We have one more question. What is the scope / parameters of what the CIA process will include? What topics are off the table?
This is Glenn. I'll take a shot at that. I think in terms of the scope, we the scope is going to consider, environmental stressors, public health stressors, demographic, socioeconomic factors. We haven't really waded into that yet. I mean, at this point, there's really nothing off the table. But to start, we're going to be looking at, what other states are doing to conduct cumulative impact analysis, seeking feedback from this stakeholder group, and then, go from there. So we don't have any predetermined, kind of idea of what it is, other than, other states and governments have used it in the various forms of cumulative impact analysis. But what we'll be creating here will be, specifically tailored toward Massachusetts.
Right, and I'll just add, this will be a very broad look. MassDEP will be initially looking at air permits. I think EEA is going to be looking at other types of environmental actions and permits, and you're going to hear from Tori about how MEPA will look at cumulative impact as well. But at this point, it's going to be a very broad look.
Great, thank you both. So it looks like we don't have any other questions at this time.
Okay, so now I'd like to turn it over to Tori to go through the MEPA process.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. And thanks again to MassDEP for organizing this forum. I think it's really an important topic, and I'm pleased to partner with DEP on the stakeholder effort and get the public input we need on this very important topic. As was mentioned earlier, the climate legislation put new mandates on MEPA specifically to incorporate a form of cumulative impact analysis into our review process. We are on a tight time frame of the end of the year to promulgate a first set of regulations to implement those requirements. So I will go over some of that timeline in a minute. I thought I would spend a couple of slides just to provide an overview of the program itself. I know that some folks may not understand what MEPA is as compared to traditional permits, so I think it's worth a description. It's modeled on the federal NEPA program, National Environmental Policy Act program. There are about 16 other states that have what are called referenced as little NEPA programs. These are all programs that were generally started in the 70s before we had the big major federal permit statutes, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. The concept is that whenever there's any form of governmental action, so NEPA would be premised on federal action, MEPA on state action, that there should be a comprehensive review of environmental impacts before those agencies take those actions. So state agency actions could be agencies undertaking public works projects directly, like Mass DOT roadway projects, Mass Port airport projects, or it could be projects that are premised on approvals, permits, funding. So it's a very broad mandate, and it is not a traditional permit in the sense that we do not approve or disapprove projects. And I know that's a misconception oftentimes that it arises as to MEPA. But I think the value add or the contribution that we bring is that it's a review that happens before a project moves to permitting. It's a precursor to permitting, and it allows both the MEPA office and the secretary, but members of the public, to have a public discourse about the pros and cons of the project. The alternatives analysis is key. So we ask for project proponents to come in with alternatives, including a no-build alternative as to why the project is needed and whether it's justified in light of the environmental consequences that it may have, and to explore and study reduced build alternatives or other options that may avoid or minimize those environmental impacts. So it's a comprehensive review. It's kind of an information gathering disclosure process. And for that reason, public participation and transparency are very key components of the MEPA review process. So not a traditional permit, but it is an opportunity before all of those design choices get finalized and the project is then presented to a permitting agency for there to be a public discourse and hopefully some choices made to avoid and minimize environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So in terms of the basic rules for when a project is required to undergo MEPA review, there's two basic requirements. One is that there's that state agency action that I described earlier. But one aspect that's unique about the Massachusetts MEPA program is that there are also these impact thresholds that are set by regulation. So these are levels of environmental impact that we have predetermined are significant enough to require this additional layer of MEPA review on top of the traditional permits that are needed. So that's a second requirement that is needed before a project is required to undergo MEPA. There are two types of thresholds in regulation. One are referenced as ENF thresholds that require the filing of an environmental notification form, typically a 30-day period. And then what's called mandatory EIR thresholds, which are higher levels of environmental impacts that require a full study process that involve not just an ENF filing, but a draft and final environmental impact report. So this EIR study process is the heart of all of these MEPA programs, because the main goal is to study impacts and study ways to avoid and minimize impacts. And the big change that was made with the climate legislation then is to say that projects that are located near environmental justice populations, provided that they are likely to cause some form of significant damage to the environment, those are automatically treated as a EIR project. So the thinking is that if you are likely to impact environmental justice populations that may already be burdened with a certain level of environmental pollution, then that warrants that additional study and deeper analysis of impacts before the state agency takes action. So that was the key component that was added and that we're looking to implement in the coming months. Next slide, please. So as many of you know already, the MEPA office had opened our regulations for review earlier in the year. So we announced our effort in February of 2021. And then of course, the climate legislation passed in March. So we have had to adjust our focus a bit, but we've always said that our goals for regulatory review is to align with statewide policy and planning efforts. So environmental justice has always been a priority, in addition to other topics like improving our review procedures around climate change, greenhouse gas, et cetera. But with the renewed focus on environmental justice due to the climate legislation, in terms of timing, our number one priority this year is to meet a statutory deadline of end of December that was set out in the climate legislation itself. So that's a pretty tight time frame, but we are, as I'll explain in a bit, we're forming an advisory committee to help us think through the rules around how this new EIR requirement should be implemented. But there is a statutory deadline, so we're looking to put in a phase 1 effort this year. I think it will necessarily be an interim approach given the expedited time frame. But given the DEP has opened this lengthy year-long stakeholder effort, we are partnering closely with DEP. I'll be engaging in this process and taking away the best thinking and lessons learned from the stakeholder effort. So we do anticipate a second phase next year, taking into account all of the work product and other lessons that we learn into another rulemaking effort next year as well. Next slide. So moving to, again, the focus this year in implementing the statutory requirements, there are 3 key sections that touch on MEPA process. So section 57 of the climate bill addressed the content of these EIRs that are submitted to the MEPA office. So this is separate and apart from EJ impacts. There was new language stating that every EIR must now address public health impacts in addition to environmental impacts and ways to minimize public health damage and adverse consequences. Next slide, please. And then section 58, this is the key EIR requirement that I described earlier, and the biggest change, I think, to the MEPA review process. So again, the key component is that for any project within 1 mile of an EJ population or within 5 miles if the project impacts air quality, provided that that project is likely to cause damage to the environment. That's a defined term in our regulations that basically refer to those thresholds that I mentioned earlier, both the ENF thresholds and those mandatory EIR thresholds. So provided that a project is hitting those thresholds and is required to undergo MEPA, if the project is located near an EJ population, that's an automatic EIR process, as opposed to that shorter ENF process that I described earlier. So, I mean, I view this as an acknowledgement in the climate legislation that, you know, if there are potential impacts to EJ populations that may be already burdened, that warrants that additional level of study and analysis before agencies take action on the project. So it's an EIR level review, and what that EIR must contain is both an assessment of an existing unfair or inequitable environmental burden and related public health consequences. Now, this is the component that I see as having the greatest overlap with what we're doing here, which is that cumulative impact analysis piece for air permitting. It's an assessment of the cumulative impact of past and present and potentially future polluting activities in an environmental EJ community to assess the level of existing environmental burden that may be borne by that population. And if there is an indication that there is that existing burden, the EIR must also address how the additional impacts from the project will exacerbate that burden essentially in a way that may result in a disproportionate adverse effect or increase or reduce the effects of climate change. Next slide, please. So finally, section 60 of the climate legislation also addressed the public participation aspect and requirements to enhance opportunities for meaningful participation by EJ populations. So here the language talks about projects that are reasonably likely to negatively affect that EJ population, and if there is an indication of negative effect, then there must be additional measures to improve public involvement. And again, the geographic area is that 1 mile, 5 mile designation. So on this, we did put out some draft protocols early in the year. One went out in February, and then a revised version in June of this year to implement these requirements. I will be incorporating that protocol into the rulemaking effort in the fall and relying on more additional guidance and input from that advisory committee. So this is not in effect right now, but we do anticipate putting the outreach protocol in effect together with that EIR requirement by the end of the year as well. Next slide, please. So activities conducted to date, as I said, we announced our rulemaking effort earlier in the year, revised that public involvement protocol for release in June, and took some initial public comments on that document until August 9th. As I indicated, that will be incorporated into the full rulemaking package in September. We spent most of the summer engaging in our own stakeholder effort through public presentations, small group sessions, and additional focus group meetings as well. And the big sort of request from various stakeholders that came out of that process was to form an advisory committee for MEPA specifically that would continue to inform our office as we move through the regulatory review process, both this year and next year as well. So that is very much underway. I am intending to start those meetings early part of September. Given our tight time frame, you know, I don't have the luxury of getting all of the input first before putting out our rulemaking package. So a draft regulatory package will be out for comment. I'm anticipating by mid-September, but forming that advisory committee, I will continue to receive public input through that forum throughout that public comment period, not only on the regulations, but associated guidance documents, both on the EIR component as well as the outreach component as well. Next slide, please. So similar to MassDEP, we have put out some key questions as related to TIA as applied to MEPA specifically. So these are the key questions that I think we will continue to grapple with, both you know, in this year in that first phase, as well as through next year as well. This first bullet, again, is the aspect that I feel has the most overlap with the CIA effort at DEP and the question is, you know, what types of factors should be included in a CIA? And for the MEPA process, it is to assess that existing environmental burden, which is the requirement in our portion of the climate legislation. So should that just be environmental factors? What types of population attributes, health indicators should be included in that assessment of the cumulative impact of past and present and potentially future activities on the EJ population? And then, as I mentioned, the climate bill added that public health impact piece as a requirement to EIR. So how should that be assessed? That is relatively new to the MEPA process. We're mainly used to assessing land and wetlands and rare species impacts, but how, you know, what are the best methodologies to then assess the public health consequences of those environmental impacts? And then if, as I said, if there is an indicator of existing environmental burden, there is that requirement of doing an additional assessment of the project's impacts to analyze whether there is likely to be a disproportionate adverse effect or increase or reduction in climate change effects. So what are the best methodologies to undertake that analysis? And then finally, what are the interim approaches that make the most sense for MEPA, even as we are engaging in this lengthier effort together with MassDEP? So this last bullet will very much be an active topic of conversation through that advisory committee process for MEPA, because we are looking to put some interim approach into effect by the end of the year. Next slide, please. And then in terms of tentative schedule, so the advisory committee, as I said, we do intend to launch in early September, right after Labor Day. We are intending to file a draft regulatory package by mid-September, but together with the advisory committee, continue to discuss both those regulations and related guidance documents. May also have a separate comment period for that guidance document as well. I do anticipate the advisory committee meetings will be open to the public. We will have designated members who are very familiar with the MEPA process and can speak with great detail about how MEPA procedures specifically should be applied or modified, but I do anticipate that there will be opportunities for broader public input as well. And then end of November is the target to file the final regulations so that they can be officially promulgated to meet that statutory deadline. And then again, considering that second phase effort next year towards the conclusion of this stakeholder effort. Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, ways to participate in MEPA. We do have our own dedicated email box specifically for the regulatory review effort. So any comments, formal comments to our regulations should be directed to this email box, and there'll be additional public hearing notices, et cetera, that will go out on this topic as well. But we do have a dedicated box. You can subscribe to our listserv to receive updates on MEPA specifically and our regulatory and other efforts. And then our MEPA website is continuously updated with information on our reg review effort. So these are all ways to participate. So I welcome, public input and participation in our own stakeholder effort, but we will be partnering with this process as well. So certainly if there are comments presented through this process that may touch on MEPA or reference MEPA, we will be following along and making note of those MEPA specific questions and comments as they come up through this effort as well. So I think those are that's the end of my slides. And I think we can break here a bit to see if there are any questions or comments specific to MEPA that I can answer right now for folks.
Thanks, Tori. We haven't received any questions yet, but we can give folks a few seconds. They might submit questions shortly.
Okay, great. Yeah, oops, light. I recognize a few names among the list of participants, so it's good to see the cross-pollination across groups.
All right, we have a question from John Walkie.
Yeah, I just wanted to check. I've got a couple of different questions, but they're not necessarily specific to MEPA, so I don't want to jump the line if there's something else in the program that you want to cover, either from the EA or whatever, before we go to general questions across the board. However you want to manage that.
Joanne, what's your thought on that?
That's all right. We're going to do some general questions in a minute, but that's all right. Go ahead. If you think some of them would touch on me, but do you think some of them will? Yeah, that's all right, John. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll ask the question in regards to frequently we've had a concern with projects and just to call it out, things with Logan Airport where projects are you've got a very large facility. You've got many different projects with many variety of impacts. And typically they are a special case in terms of their environmental data reports that go in more or less annually, and then they have the supplemental data, whatever it is, another acronym. But it feels quite frequently that projects are segmented and that there's something about a parking garage, but we're only talking about that. And then there's something about a terminal expansion, but we're only talking about that. And there's something about something else but as taken as a package, cumulatively, there is obviously a plan that does not get segmented. There's a plan somewhere of how things are being developed. That plan never really receives a review where the cumulative impact of that development is assessed for what its impact will be, specifically on the air quality for the sightline communities within the airport's purview. So I'm just sort of curious as to how, when these smaller projects come in encapsulated to a MEPA review or for permits from any other agency, how do we break down that barrier of a segmented project and start looking at that cumulative impact of an entire facility or the larger project?
Yeah, I can address that a bit, John. I think you're touching on the concept of cumulative impact in two separate contexts. One is the concept of cumulative impact that I think is already embedded in these types of MEPA and NEPA programs. That concept of if there are multiple projects happening in a similar time frame or a similar regional area, that should be reviewed in a cumulative fashion. So those are already in our rules. I think with Logan Airport, it's you know, certainly if there's multiple projects that are happening in a similar time frame, we would ask Massport to come in with a common filing. But you're right. I mean, the mechanism for conducting that cumulative impact analysis has been those ESPRs and EDRs to date. But I think what the big contribution from this climate legislation is that the cumulative impact in that separate sense of you know, the cumulative environmental burden that continues to add to a particular EJ population that's defined more by neighborhood, you know, rather than in this broader sense, that will now be assessed through the methodology that we're discussing right now, and through that parallel methodology at MEPA. So I mean, I think it would be interesting to see how, you know, mapping tools like EJ Screen would view those census blocks around Logan Airport and what is the level of existing environmental burden. So Massport will now have to address that EJ component as part of those smaller project filings, in addition to those EDRs and ESPRs. So I think that is the big contribution and the change that the climate legislation has made in terms of assessment of cumulative impacts in the context of EJ population. Massport, incidentally, will participate in our advisory committee, and we have several NGOs that are focused on air quality topics. So I do foresee that coming up through our process as well.
Great. Thanks for that question, John. So we did receive a question through the chat box. Does MEPA plan to provide guidance to project applicants in performing EJ or CIA assessments?
Yes, absolutely. And that is very much that will be the focus, #1 topic for the advisory committee. And so I am asking the members to meet weekly in September and October. I haven't convened the group quite yet, but once we launched it, you know, given the tight time frame, I will be asking the designated members to really focus on this topic over the next couple of months to develop just what you're describing, a guidance document to provide more rules other than just sort of the broad statutory framework that's out there right now. So definitely on our list of to-dos.
Great, thanks, Tori. So someone's asking if you could please explain the difference between phase 1 and phase 2. Will the regulations be amended to include CIA from the Mass Department of Environmental Protection older process?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, it's a little hard to know what phase 2 will look like, given that we're so early in this stakeholder effort. But yes, I mean, one option could be to further revise our regulations. The initial draft that we'll put out this fall to either refine, put more detail in, or even change or modify approaches that we have developed this year. So that's definitely an option. You know, another option would be just to further refine our guidance document. So it's unclear, not knowing what the end product of this process will be, but right now the anticipation is that our regulations would be reopened for refinement, you know, revision next year, but hard to know at this point.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. It looks like we don't have any other questions. Oh, just kidding. We have one from John again.
Yeah, I've got a slew. Just in terms of, we mentioned the sort of three areas, DEP on air permits and MEPA and EEA. When it comes to water permits, we just had a bunch of NIPD's permits go out, one of them for the airport, as well as for the oil terminals along Chelsea Creek. I'm just curious as to I see that the legislation is sort of written that it calls out the air permits. Is the water side of the equation just going to be sort of wrapped up within MEPA and other locations, or is that going to be incorporated into the processes that exist for some of the different water related permits?
Yeah, so I don't know if Rishi is on, our EJ director, but certainly any water permits that would trigger MEPA review would in turn trigger the EJ analysis requirements through MEPA. But as I said, as you know, MEPA isn't approving or disapproving the permit. So, but I will mention that third component, the interagency work group that Rishi Reddy is leading. That effort is intended to bring together all of the relevant other state agencies that could potentially incorporate CIA into their respective programs. So I know that many of DEP's water and solid waste and other folks are participating in that committee. So, obviously it wasn't called out specifically in the legislation per se, but there is an effort through this interagency work group to start exploring whether CIA could be appropriate for other programs besides air permits and MEPA.
And I just want to, I don't know if folks can hear me. I tried to unmute myself here. This is Rishi. I just want to second that, Tori, what you said, that is the water issues are very much an issue that we'd be looking at through that interagency group.
Cool. Thank you very much. That answers it. And I guess the last thing, which is less a question and more just something to put on the radar, relative to environmental justice. We're kind of going through a moment of inversion. We've been talking quite a bit about the environmental burdens that are disproportionately put on the communities. We think of the Boston we grew up with in the 70s and 80s. It is not the Boston we're living with today in the 2020s. And there are ostensibly projects coming in. I'll throw out as an example, Suffolk Downs as one that went through a MEPA process and has a number of different permits that are going through. Those are projects that are ostensibly bringing in positive things that might have climate benefits. However, they will have impacts that potentially have negative impacts on environmental justice communities that might not be immediately. We're expecting power plants, we're expecting highways, things that have these very blatantly negative environmental impacts that we link directly to asthma rates and things. However, having suddenly the market rate of your rental apartment go through the roof has obviously very detrimental health effects on communities that are being really squeezed. So that is going for environmental justice organizations. This is kind of a weird, brave new world that we're going into. White flight has turned into white flood. And we're trying to hold the line for the communities that we represent and work with and are composed of in these communities. And so frequently when a project comes in that sounds like it's doing a lot of good, I would just underline the need to look under the hood and be cognizant of some of the negative impacts, especially in terms of housing, that could result from rehabbing a whole bunch of houses and making them energy efficient, and a solar panel on the roof could also result in people being evicted from the house because they no longer can pay the rent. So these kinds of impacts are things that are not immediately apparent, and they feel as if they're sliding away from the environment. But hopefully they do have a health impact, public health impact, and they definitely have a direct impact on the communities that we're working with. So I would just highlight that as a parking lot issue to be discussed at some point along the way in the coming year or so.
Mm-hmm.
John, if I could just address that very briefly, that the cumulative impact work group that we're just pulling together, as we know, we're behind the DEP process here, which is more of evolved, is seeking to pull in, as Glenn had said, individuals and staff from other secretariats and agencies. So some of the components that you just named that are considered to be part and parcel of the social determinants of health, we're incorporating those aspects. And we're also seeking to get representatives from housing and economic development. So we're trying to pull in folks from a broader spectrum than we've done in the past as we're looking at these type of environmental issues. So we're traveling towards that as well in the way that you're describing. I see that there's another question here about TURA reporters, and I'm not sure that I understand completely what that question's about, but I did want to point out that this larger group is also has representatives from the Office of Technical Assistance that do a lot of work with TURA and TURA reporters, so that would also be incorporated into the conversation. I don't know what the full text of that question was, but I just wanted to say that. I see it on the chat.
Thanks, Rishi. Yeah, and if the person who submitted that question wants to provide more context, you're welcome to. So we have a question, I believe for Tori. Is it assumed that MEPA and or MassDEP CIA processes will always be initiated in response to a project proponent, or will it be possible for an overburdened EJ community to seek a CIA in order to require reduction in emissions by existing projects and or prevent additional proposals that would impact health and the environment?
Yeah, I could address that briefly. So our definition of project in the MEPA statute does talk about work, project, or activity that will impact the environment. So as a general matter, we are looking at sort of new activity projects and not sort of existing projects. So even a renewal of a permit, if it's just to kind of renew existing authorization, is often not a trigger for MEPA. However, I think in terms of sort of preventing additional pollution in the neighborhood, as I indicated earlier, that is the big change that I view as having been implemented through the climate legislation. Is you're not just looking at the small incremental impact of each project as they come along. It's now requiring the proponent to look at the cumulative impact and the existing burden that already exists in the community, and to assess the marginal impacts on top of that. So I think even if we're looking at smaller projects, for example, and in that context, we will hopefully be able to see that bigger picture of the overall impacts to the EJ population. And I also wanted to just follow on a little bit to Rishi's comment earlier, and I saw there was another comment in the chat or question about economic impacts, which is I think what John is getting at as well. So I think that is very much something we will need to think through in that public health piece. When the legislation now says an EIR must address public health impacts, how broad are we going beyond your traditional environmental impacts? The definition of damage to the environment is a statutory term, and it does talk about damage to natural resources. So whether we're now looking at public health impacts that flow from environmental impacts or sort of public health writ large is something that we will need to grapple with. Obviously economic insecurity has public health consequences, but it is definitely not something that we have traditionally looked at MEPA. So things like displacement and gentrification are certainly new topics that may be introduced. But that whole topic of benefit versus a negative effect, every project comes in saying they have a whole host of public benefits, right? So that will definitely be, I think, a new dynamic through the MEPA process of how do you weigh those pros and cons of each project, and how should we be characterizing public health impacts in light of those new requirements. So definitely good questions to ask.
Thanks, Tori. So it looks like Lynn Santos has a question, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that question. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear
Oh,
you.
okay, good. I just wanted to clarify the question about Tura reporters. I just was trying to imagine what it would look like for them. And I don't know if you had any initial thoughts. Is it just going to be like another checkbox that they are located next to an EJ community? Or what are are there any initial thoughts about what that means for a Tura reporter? So I don't know if the question is about whether a Tura reporter would now have to undergo additional analysis through the MEPA process. So if that's the question, yeah, we've actually had some consultation with the Tura office. And for the most part, I don't think that just merely being a Tura reporter would trigger MEPA review necessarily, unless there's a new project that's being undertaken. So if there's a new project that hits our thresholds and requires an agency permit or approval, then certainly those would have to go through MEPA and meet those new requirements. But I think where Tura was, so I don't, was that your question or was that? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that my question might be for Rishi.
Okay.
Just that, how is that going to change? Is it going to change anything? Is this going to change anything for Tura reporters as far as what they have to report outside of MEPA?
Lynn, what we're looking at now at this stage is, I don't think I know yet enough about how our process is going to go to be able to answer that with any clarity. But I do know that part of what we'll be looking at is consolidating information and data so that we could see where clustering happens. In terms of being able to actually see what's out there is a first step for us. So if we're looking at Tura reporters and then looking at a map overlay, which we already have that data, of course, we're going to be putting those tools together as a first step. So I don't know, I don't think I know yet enough about how our process will go forward because there's so many entities involved in it. So that's how we're looking at the process for right now.
Oh, okay.
So Rishi, I assume you have somebody that might be, who works on Tura that's involved in your interagency group. And that your process might feed back to some of the discussions and work of the Tura Council, which ultimately governs Tura reporting.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Christine.
I think that's one of the feedback loops there.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for your question, Lynn. It looks like we don't have any other questions. We can give folks another second or two, but else we can move on.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for a good discussion. I just wanted to do a few wrap-up slides with you. The next step for the MassDEP process. I have a few, as we mentioned, we would like you to continue to submit input or comments to us. If we receive your comments and input to this email mailbox by September 21st, we'll summarize your comments for the next stakeholder meeting. But we will always receive comments at this mailbox. There really isn't a deadline where we won't receive them, but if we receive them by the 21st, we are going to summarize comments at the next stakeholder meeting. So we encourage you to get them in by the 21st. If you want to be added to our CIA listserv, please enter your information at the link information at the link provided on the second bullet, and the third bullet is the CIA website on the mass.gov website is the page for the CIA information. Because of the two processes, I know it's a lot of different places to go. We put the information of the links for the comments and inputs together, as well as the 2 distribution lists, as well as the 2 websites, so that it would be very clear where the information is on the 2 processes. We thought this would be very helpful for you to reference. These slides, of course, will be on the website for you. And finally, we did just have a number of questions, but before we end the meeting, we're happy to take any more questions that you may have that are broader than what you just did, relative mostly to the MEPA process. If you have any further questions that you would like to raise at this time before we close the meeting. And we'll also be here a few more minutes at the end of the meeting as well. And again, we definitely would like to thank everybody for participating. We really hope to see you again at future meetings, and we really appreciate everyone's discussion and being so having such great questions and interacting with us. So.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. We'll be here for a few minutes, or, as you're happy to stay, or if you need to get home to your families.
Looks like we don't have any additional questions, but we can give folks a few more minutes.
Okay, I think we'll close the meeting. Christine, with that?
Thanks, Joanne. And I think we're down to just a few people left from outside the agencies. So for those of you who have stuck with us, thank you very much for attending. And we look forward to your comments that are due. We're asking for comments. We're going to accept comments for any part of the process until, throughout the process, but we're asking for comments on this meeting by September 21st so that we can respond next time. And we'll be in touch soon, I guess, for the next session. And this has been 2 great meetings and good involvement, and appreciate everybody's time.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your night, everybody. Goodbye.